When submarines were initially developed, they had a terrible reputation, and for good reason. There had been numerous accidents and many sailors whose final resting place was the ocean floor, so much so that the submarine service had earned the grim nickname, the Coffin Service. In 1939, one of the worst of these incidents would further cement this reputation. This is that terrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Between the end of World War I and the first shots of World War II, navies across the world were tirelessly working on developing and testing submarine technology. Up to that point, waging war beneath the sea was done through crude methods, but the early 1920s saw a significant leap forward in submarine capabilities. Nations raced against one another to construct and deploy more advanced submarines that could dive deeper, move faster, and operate longer than ever before. Like other nations, the United States invested heavily in strengthening its fleet with state-of-the-art submarines, and in 1938 it introduced its Sargo-class ships, which were equipped with new lead-acid batteries designed to withstand battle damage. One of these was the USS Squalus, one of the first in its class, capable of reaching depths of 250 feet, surface speeds of up to 20 knots, and distances of 11,000 miles on a single fuel tank. Even by the rapidly advancing standards of submarine technology, the Squalus and its sister ship, the USS Sculpin, were ahead of their time. They were designed in the years leading up to World War II to help cut off Japanese trade, and had the ability to escape enemy planes by fully submerging in under a minute while traveling at full speed, something no other submarine could do. Once the Squalus was completed, the Navy began a series of test dives to ensure its design was secure, and its components could endure the conditions expected of them. These tests were taken extremely seriously, as between 1921 and 1938, a total of 825 men from 18 submarines across various countries had perished in sub-accidents. As a result, submarining had earned the moniker the Coffin Service in the media and among the public. But the Sargo class of ships aimed to change that reputation, and thankfully, by that time, in its test runs, the Squalus was performing its tasks and operations almost flawlessly. On the morning of May 23, 1939, the Squalus departed from the mouth of the Piscataqua River for another test dive, carrying a crew of 53 officers and sailors. Also aboard were 2 civilian Navy engineers and a General Motors representative who had designed the submarine's batteries. Then, under the command of Rear Admiral Oliver F. Naquin, the sub was directed toward the New Hampshire coast, just a few miles from the Isle of Shoals. That day's test was set to include underwater maneuvers, multiple dives, and resurfacings, making it as routine a trial as the ship had ever undergone. Around 9 a.m., the horn blared throughout the submarine, signaling an imminent dive order from the captain. At that moment, the sub was on the surface, moving at 16 knots, and the admiral stood behind a large control board filled with lights that would illuminate red or green depending on the status of different parts of the vessel. The dive procedure heavily relied on the engine room crewmen, who, upon hearing the signal, had to quickly shut off the diesel-powered engines and close the air vents before submerging. Just before issuing the official dive order, the admiral ensured that the entire panel was lit green. When everything appeared to be in order, he gave the final command, and the Squalus descended beneath the surface. However, just as it did, a fluttering sensation in his ears signaled a sudden change in air pressure, and the intercom suddenly erupted with a crewman shouting to bring the sub back up. Despite what the control board indicated, one of the vents remained wide open, allowing seawater to flood the engine rooms. Admiral Oliver simply stared in disbelief, as what his crew was reporting should have been impossible based on what he was seeing. Regardless, he immediately ordered the ballast tanks to be blown in an attempt to bring the Squalus to the surface as quickly as possible. Horrifyingly, the submarine took on water faster than it could ascend, and after an initial brief rise, the Squalus slowed to a stop. Meanwhile, in the engine room, the crew was battling an unstoppable torrent of water, struggling just to stay alive as the submarine tilted downward at a 45-degree angle and began its rapid descent to the ocean floor. It was then that Oliver faced a decision no officer ever wants to make. He knew that the survival of anyone on board depended on sealing the watertight doors between the control room and the engine room compartments. Doing so, however, would trap those still inside as water completely consumed their section of the ship. But at the same time, failing to seal off the compartments would mean everyone on board would perish. Admiral Oliver was known as a strict, no-nonsense, disciplined leader, and there was a very good reason for this. In submarines, every single decision and action taken could result in catastrophe. There was no room for mistakes, and in dire moments like this, unfortunately, there was also no room for mercy. Oliver then gave the order to close off the control room compartment with men still inside. The man responsible for this task, Lloyd Mannix, pushed all his weight into sealing the 200-pound door while hearing the desperate screams of men begging him to wait. But there was no time. Water was already surging toward the bulkhead behind them, so the compartment door had to be sealed immediately. As he pulled the door shut, several crew members struggling against the flood managed to slip through to safety just before it locked. He then cranked the wheel to ensure it was airtight, ultimately sealing the fate of those left in the 4 flooded compartments, including Sherman Shirley, Lloyd's closest friend. Tragically, Sherman was supposed to get married soon, and Lloyd had been chosen as his best man. Among the others were 17 crewmen who had attempted to lock themselves inside the torpedo room and 9 trapped in the engine and rear battery compartments. One man even climbed a ladder and attempted to force open an exterior hatch. But the water pressure outside was too strong for the door to budge. The Squalus then continued its uncontrolled descent as the batteries in the flooded compartments shorted out from the seawater. And as if the freefall wasn't terrifying enough, the lights flickered before shutting off completely, plunging the surviving crew into total darkness. This introduced a new threat. Chief Electrician Lawrence Gaynor grabbed a flashlight and crawled into the battery compartment, where he found that while many batteries were already submerged, others were still wet and overheating. If the heat reached the battery cells, an explosion would rip the submarine apart. Without hesitation, he flipped the first disconnect switch, which sparked a blinding flash of light. Barely able to see, he felt around for the second switch and managed to cut power just in time, narrowly avoiding a much worse disaster. Back in the control room, no one knew how far they would continue to fall, as the submarine was only rated for a maximum depth of 250 feet. If the ocean floor was much deeper than that, the hull could implode. All they could do was wait in the silence and darkness as the sub groaned, sinking further into the abyss. Then, with a heavy thud, the Squalus struck the bottom of the Atlantic at 240 feet. It came to rest completely vertical, nose down. The 33 survivors were trapped in the air pocket they had created, but there was no time to panic. They immediately sprang into action, activating emergency signals, deploying a buoy with a communication cable, and firing distress flares. Their only hope now was that someone on the surface would see them before their air ran out. Below the dark waters, the crew of the Squalus was doing everything possible to ensure their survival. Despite being trapped 240 feet below the surface, their training took over, and they methodically followed every emergency procedure they had drilled countless times before. The first priority was to make their presence known. A bright yellow buoy attached to the submarine by a steel cable, was released. If it reached the surface, it would not only help rescuers locate them, but also provide a direct line of communication. Additionally, the crew fired signal flares and released smoke bombs, hoping that someone on the surface would spot them. Meanwhile, a growing concern among the men was the possibility that some of their fellow sailors might have survived in other compartments. To find out, one crew member picked up a hammer and began tapping against the metal piping that ran along the length of the submarine. If anyone else was alive, they would recognize the sound and respond. After a few steady taps, the room fell silent as they listened for any reply. The seconds dragged on, but no answering knock came. It was a brutal confirmation. Nearly half of the crew had perished. Back in the control room, Admiral Oliver directed his men to retrieve emergency supplies. They gathered food rations, flashlights, oxygen reserves, carbon dioxide absorbent materials, blankets, and heavy coats. He knew they were in for a long and uncertain wait, and without power, the temperature inside the submarine was going to drop quickly. Once supplies were distributed, Oliver turned his attention to another critical issue: their dwindling air supply. With 33 men still alive in a sealed compartment, he estimated they had about 48 hours of breathable air before they would begin to suffocate. That seemed like ample time for a rescue, if one was already on the way, but to be safe, he ordered extreme conservation measures. Oliver then divided the crew into two groups. The 10 strongest and youngest were instructed to move into the torpedo room, the coldest part of the submarine, while the other 23 remained in the control room, which retained more warmth. One of the sailors distributed Momsen lungs, a primitive breathing apparatus designed to help submariners escape and swim to the surface. However, the Squalus was 40 feet deeper than the device was rated for, meaning no one knew if it would function at such a depth. Even if it did, it was unclear whether they would have enough oxygen to make the dangerous ascent. The devices were given out as a last resort. If the rescue failed, this would be their only option. With their fate hanging in the balance, Oliver instructed the crew to rest and conserve oxygen. Some managed to sleep despite the overwhelming anxiety, while others kept their minds occupied by whistling quiet tunes. As time dragged on, the temperature inside the sub plummeted to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius, and frost began forming on the inner hull. The weight was unbearable, and the only question left was whether help would arrive before their oxygen ran out. Up on the surface, when the Squalus failed to return on schedule, the Navy quickly suspected something had gone wrong. At that time, its sister ship, the USS Sculpin, was preparing to depart from New Hampshire for a mission in Panama. However, the moment news of the Squalus's disappearance reached them, the Sculpin immediately left port, heading straight for the sub's last known location. Upon reaching the coordinates given by the Navy, Sculpin's captain, Warren Wilkins, expected to see the emergency buoy from the Squalus floating on the surface. But there was nothing. Unknown to them at the time, the buoy had become tangled and failed to deploy. Worse still, the coordinates given to the Sculpin had been written down incorrectly. The search vessel was scouring the wrong location. Just as it seemed all hope might be lost, one of the Sculpin's lookouts spotted a faint red flare in the distance. Without hesitation, Captain Wilkins gave the order to change course. As they approached, they finally saw the emergency buoy bobbing in the water. Below the surface, the crew of the Squalus actually heard the sound of the Sculpin's engines approaching, and morale skyrocketed. Help had finally arrived. But just as Oliver made contact with Sculpin through the cable phone inside the buoy, something went terribly wrong. A sudden ocean swell snapped the buoy's tether, cutting off all communication. For the next several hours, The Sculpin crew had no choice but to drag a massive grappling hook along the ocean floor, hoping to catch onto the Squalus once again. After a grueling effort, they finally re-established contact. Once the Sculpin confirmed the presence of survivors inside the submarine, they sent an urgent message to the Navy. In return, they received a 3-letter reply, SRC, short for Submarine Rescue Chamber. Oliver immediately recognized the meaning. There was only one SRC available on the entire East Coast, and, by pure luck, it was already in Connecticut, loaded onto a rescue ship called the USS Falcon and en route to their location. The Submarine Rescue Chamber was an experimental 9-ton capsule designed specifically for deep-sea rescues. Resembling an upside-down wine glass, the chamber was designed to latch onto a submarine's hatch, allowing trapped crew members to climb inside before being hoisted to the surface. The problem? It had never been used in a real-life rescue before. At 4:30 a.m., the USS Falcon finally arrived above the Squalus, bringing with it the SRC and a team of divers. Just in time, too. The men inside the sub were nearing 24 hours of entrapment, and oxygen was running dangerously low. To stretch their remaining air supply, Oliver periodically released emergency oxygen from stored tanks, but only in short bursts, ensuring it would last as long as possible. Unfortunately, his crew was already showing signs of hypercapnia, or carbon dioxide poisoning. Headaches, nausea, and dizziness had set in. If they were left down there much longer, they would begin slipping into unconsciousness, never to wake up again. Hypothermia was also becoming a major threat. Some of the men had managed to escape the flooding compartments just before they were sealed off, meaning they were still soaked to the bone. Without heat, their body temperatures were rapidly dropping. On the surface, divers carefully lowered the SRC into the water, alongside a support diver responsible for securing it to the submarine's hatch. Although this seemed straightforward, it was an incredibly dangerous job. At the time, deep-sea diving technology was still in its infancy. The Navy had just begun experimenting with special helium-oxygen gas mixtures to combat nitrogen narcosis, a dangerous condition where divers at extreme depths become disoriented and lose motor control. However, this technology wasn't widely used yet, meaning divers could only remain at depths like 240 feet for about 20 minutes before suffering severe side effects. As the first diver descended into the abyss, he soon began experiencing narcosis symptoms, his mind clouding. Disoriented, he accidentally crashed headfirst into the hull of the Squalus. Miraculously, he managed to regain his bearings and successfully attach the rescue cable. Behind him, the SRC followed its slow, careful descent. Once the SRC reached the Squalus, the two operators inside carefully maneuvered the chamber until its rubber gasket sealed tightly against the sub's hatch. Water was then pumped out, and when the pressure equalized, the hatch wheel was turned. As the door creaked open, a rush of water spilled in momentarily before revealing the trapped sailors inside. Standing before them were the SRC crew, holding warm blankets and hot coffee. For the first time in nearly 2 days, the men knew they were going to make it out alive. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. With space for only 8 men at a time, the survivors would have to be lifted in groups. The first men chosen were those closest to hypothermia, while the healthiest remained behind. The first trip to the surface began, but the process was painstakingly slow. One round trip took nearly 3.5 hours. Time was running out, and soon a new disaster would strike, threatening to undo the entire rescue operation. Despite being so close to salvation, the men trapped inside the Squalus still had to endure an agonizingly slow rescue process. The Submarine Rescue Chamber, SRC, could only carry 8 men at a time, and each round trip took approximately 3.5 hours, 1 hour to descend, another to secure and load survivors, and an hour and a half to ascend. For the 33 survivors, that meant the operation could take well over a full day. The men still waiting below suffered worsening hypercapnia from the rising carbon dioxide levels, causing pounding headaches and nausea. The frigid temperatures made things worse, with ice forming along the inner walls of the submarine. Some of the men were unable to move their fingers due to the cold, and others, still drenched from their escape from the flooding compartments, began slipping into the early stages of hypothermia. Inside the control room, Admiral Oliver Nacken continued managing the situation with precision. Knowing that oxygen levels were dropping fast, he ordered his men to minimize movement and speak only when absolutely necessary. Every breath wasted meant less time for the final survivors to be pulled out. The first 3 rescue trips were successful, bringing 23 men to the surface. Only 10 men remained, including Admiral Oliver himself, who refused to leave until the last trip. But just when everything seemed to be going according to plan, disaster struck. On its 4th and final descent, the SRC successfully latched onto the submarine, and the last 10 crew members climbed inside. However, during the ascent, something went terribly wrong. At 150 feet, one of the stabilizing cables jammed, causing the chamber to stop abruptly in the water column. The sudden halt also frayed the main cable connecting the chamber to the USS Falcon, and 5 of the 7 steel strands snapped. The chamber, now dangling by just 2 thin strands, was at risk of plummeting back down or worse, snapping entirely, sending the crew to the bottom of the ocean with no hope of retrieval. Realizing the urgency of the situation, a diver was sent down to assess the damage. Battling against narcosis and freezing temperatures, he reached the chamber and discovered that the only option was to cut the jammed stabilizing cable. However, this cable played a crucial role. It not only guided the chamber up and down, but also prevented it from spinning wildly in the water. With no other alternative, the order was given to cut the stabilizer cable. The moment it was severed, the SRC became uncontrollable. It began spinning violently, tossing the trapped survivors inside against the walls. For the men already weakened by cold and oxygen deprivation, the disorienting motion was unbearable. Recognizing the grave risk of further damage, the decision was made to the chamber back to the ocean floor. A heartbreaking moment for the final 10 survivors, who had just been less than 200 feet from safety. On board the USS Falcon, tensions were at an all-time high. With the chamber still intact but unable to use the winch system safely, rescuers had to make a drastic decision. Instead of relying on the winch, they would pull the chamber up by hand, 240 feet to the surface. It was a painstaking effort, requiring dozens of sailors to haul the 9-ton capsule using nothing but manpower. The process took a grueling 4 hours, but slowly, the SRC made its way back toward the surface. Finally, at 9:30 p.m., nearly 40 hours after the Squalus had first sunk, the final group of survivors emerged from the chamber, cold, exhausted, and barely conscious, but alive. Every single one of the 33 survivors had made it to the surface, marking one of the most successful submarine rescues in naval history. However, the 25 men trapped in the flooded compartments had perished. As soon as the survivors were stabilized, the Navy turned its attention to recovering the Squalus itself. The submarine was brand new, and at a depth that made it possible, though extremely difficult, to salvage. However, an operation of this scale had never been attempted before. For the next 4 months, the Navy worked relentlessly to bring the vessel back to the surface. The first attempt involved strapping large, deflated pontoons to the hull, which would be inflated with air to lift the sub. However, during the initial test, the pontoons expanded too quickly, causing the Squalus to shoot uncontrollably to the surface, break free from the chains, and sink back down to the ocean floor. After 5 separate attempts using different techniques, the submarine was finally raised and towed back to the shipyard. Upon examination, the investigation determined that the catastrophe had not been caused by human error. Instead, a mechanical malfunction had prevented one of the air vents from closing, allowing water to flood the compartments. This critical failure had not been indicated on the control board, making it impossible for the crew to detect before it was too late. For his extraordinary leadership, Admiral Oliver Naquin was commended by the Navy, but he refused to take full credit, instead praising his crew for their discipline and sacrifice. In his official report, he described witnessing a true example of camaraderie and brotherhood, as the men had shared supplies, huddled for warmth, and even sacrificed their own comfort for those in worse condition. He also highlighted the bravery of Chief Electrician Lawrence Gaynor, whose quick thinking in cutting off the batteries had prevented an explosion that could have destroyed the sub entirely. His actions had saved every man still alive, but they came at a cost. When he disconnected the first battery, the electric arc was so intense that it left him with permanent vision problems. Despite the severe damage, the Squalus was rebuilt and recommissioned under a new name, the USS Sailfish. It was later used in combat during World War II, and 3 of the Squalus survivors even returned to serve on the refurbished vessel. Sadly, not all of them would survive the war. 4 of the original crewmen were later killed in action. As for Admiral Oliver Naquin, he never commanded a submarine again. Instead, he transitioned to an engineering officer role aboard the USS California. During Pearl Harbor, the California was one of the primary targets of the Japanese attack. By sheer luck, Oliver was on shore at the time and survived. Meanwhile, the USS Sculpin, which had played a critical role in the rescue, was destroyed by a Japanese warship in 1943. However, in a remarkable twist of fate, the USS Sailfish, formerly the Squalus, later sank that very same Japanese destroyer, avenging its fallen sister ship. Shortly after the war, the Sailfish was decommissioned, bringing an end to the long and tragic story of the Squalus. More than 80 years later, the rescue and recovery of the Squalus remains one of the most challenging and successful operations in Navy history. To this day, the bravery and quick thinking of Oliver Naquin and his crew are part of the Navy's official handbook on submarine rescue operations. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the link in the description, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.